Welcome to Introduction to Variance Analysis. We're going to talk about variances, static budget variances, flexible budget, sales volume variance, flexible budget variance, and then we'll wrap it up. Start with an example. You're given the following income statement data for a manufacturing company. It shows the actual amounts next to the budgeted or fixed or static budget amounts planned. Clearly, the operating profit is better than the planned amount. As you can see, 119,000 instead of 91,000. What's the reason? Revenues are lower than planned, and fixed administrative expenses are higher, but the rest of the expenses are lower. More information is needed to assess things such as sales effectiveness, efficiency of manufacturing, and cost controls. Examples of those are how many units were sold as compared to budget, what were the input amounts versus the planned input amounts for each unit produced. That's for direct materials, direct labor, and overheads. What were the input prices, the input costs for the manufacture as compared to the budgeted values, the cost of materials, the cost of labor, etc. Variances are simply the difference between measured values we have here. They're shown always as positive numbers or almost always with the additional information given as unfavorable or favorable. Favorable means profits would be increased because of the difference. Unfavorable means profits would decrease because of the difference. An example would be that higher revenues than planned are favorable differences, therefore lower ones are unfavorable ones. Higher costs, on the other hand, are unfavorable differences, and lower costs than planned are favorable. The static budget variance is just the difference between the actual and the static budget. So here we have no consideration for the volume of units sold or manufactured, as the case may be. Here, the unfavorable and favorable signs are consistent with the direction of increasing profits for favorable or decreasing profits for unfavorable. So we have lower sales than the static budget says. That's why it's unfavorable. But we're favorable in terms of the costs of direct materials, labor, variable overhead, and fixed overheads. We're again higher for the fixed admin and selling expenses. A flexible budget is like asking what would the static or fixed budget have looked like if the sales volume had been projected correctly or equivalent to the actual amount. It relates to change in each of the line item values from sales all the way to operating income caused by a change in the sales volume. That's the first step in determining the sources of variation in the actual results as compared to the static budget. Coming back to our income statement data for a manufacturing company, it shows the actual amounts next to the fixed budget amounts planned. So for that, we need the units sold. So that's shown here, as you can see. Now, how did we get to the static budget? Well, or rather the flexible budget, sorry. We place the flexible budget, I'd like to also add, in the middle here between our static and our actual. We'll see it towards the end again, how it fixes and binds together. The flexible budget, it's based on the static budget. The only value that we use from the actual result is the units sold. The variable costs are recalibrated based on the actual units sold, and the fixed costs are kept at the static budget levels. Coming back here, if we look at direct material usage, the use per unit looking at the static budget would be 48,840 divided by the 2,200. That gives us the $22.20 per unit. Now using that on the flexible budget, we have 2,300 units, so the budget would have been, again, using that amount, $22.20 per unit times 2,300 units, so it's 51,060, which is the number we have here. This will be done also for the direct labor, variable overhead as well. For fixed costs, so fixed overheads, fixed admin and selling costs, they will stay the same. So we have here a consistency across for those. Now, sales volume variance is the variance caused due to the fact that the actual volume of sales is different from the planned amount. The revenue variance would be favorable due, of course, to the higher volume sold in this case, 100 more. We have 2,300 units. And the costs, the expenses, the direct material usage, direct labor, and variable overheads would be unfavorable for the same reason. The flexible budget variance is now the difference between the flexible budget and the actual result. It's not due anymore to the volume of units sold because we've covered that difference now. So here we have the actual amounts and the flexible budget amounts. Here we can see the revenues are unfavorable. They're down by 27,600. That would be indicative of a lower sales price because we have the same number of units sold. So it's not because of the number of units, it's definitely because of the sales price. Most of the costs, as you can see here, though, are favorable. And that results in a net favorable amount of 21,119. As an overview, we start off with the actuals on the left, we have the static budget on the right, and in the middle we place the flexible budget. The units sold again, this flexible budget is the same as the actual, but the variable costs and the variable sales revenues are consistent with the amounts expected from the static budget. Now the sales volume variance is the difference between the flexible budget and the static budget. And the flexible budget variance is the difference between the actual amounts and the flexible budget. When we add those together, we end up with the static budget variance, which is a total difference between the actual and the static budget. That was the initial introduction where we talk about flexible budgets, how they fit and how we calculate from that the sales volume variance and the flexible budget variance. This can go into much more detail as it does later on, but as an introduction, hopefully that helped, and thank you for your attention.